All right, welcome to Module 1, Week 2. Today we're talking about tourism as a development factor. So what is development? Development in this course is about becoming more from less, right? And development can occur both exteriorly, that is, can be measured by objective tools, for example, such as fetal development. You can see that from the fertilized egg to the zygote to the fetus is becoming more, right? And then you can also develop interiorly, things that can't be measured by objective tools, such as the interior of our own minds. We did talk about Piaget last week. Well, here we can see there's also ego development theory, where we study the consciousness of a fetus all the way up to a guru, a spiritual guru. Well, any religion at all, in fact. And you may have heard of, obviously, Piaget, Freud, Bloom, Maslow. They are all development psychologists, and they all looked at development in the interior of our mind. In fact, philosopher Ken Wilber says, through development and evolution, we have increasing complexity, interconnectivity, consciousness, and diversity. But quality improvement or something getting better is subjective, in fact, because some people see it one way, other people see it a different way, and it depends on the beholder. Consider this road, right? The road goes into a destination. Some people see this as development, as positive improvement, because it brings more tourists in. Others see it as a negative development because it brings more tourists in and all the negative effects that come with them just as well. Another example might be a cancer tumor. From the point of view of the patient, cancer development would be a bad thing, right? From the point of view of the tumor, its own development would be a good thing, would be a qualitative improvement. And in fact, as it qualitatively improves, the cancer tumor adjusts its environment to promote its own existence. In the same way, a baby, and I'm not saying a baby is a cancer, but a baby or a pregnancy adjusts the body to promote its own self-interest, its own improvement. And tourism does the same thing with communities. It transforms the space around it to make it more favorable for the growth of tourism. It may transform the policies, the infrastructure, the investment, all different kinds of aspects. It transforms that environment so that tourism can be more successful. But tourism doesn't, or transformation, I should say, of tourism doesn't happen just yes or no. It happens across many different indicators and many different indicators or variables, sorry. So more income might come into the community, benefiting some people, but not other people. Especially investors tend to benefit more, and poor people tend to benefit less. The place, certain aspects of the character of the place could be improved by tourism, while others could be damaged. So development is discontinuous, right? It improves in some ways and reduces or gets worse in other ways. And in both of those cases, it depends on who's actually observing it and who is making the subjective evaluation. So this is an important point, that even though things are improving and getting worse in any development context, especially in tourism context, there may be a consensus feeling or a general feeling that is improvement, that there is a center of gravity, that development is actually occurring in this destination, where the majority are in agreement, because it's very unlikely that everybody will ever be in agreement about that. Well, since we're talking about development and sustainability, I wanted to take you back to an early and important classic in the environmental literature and in the sustainability literature. And this was in 1972, the publishing of the book called Limits to Growth. When it was published, it became an instant bestseller, translated into 30 languages around the world, selling millions of copies. But at the same time, it provoked major and aggressive dissent of those who would not accept that there is such thing as limits to growth to our economy. So the people who wrote this, Donella Meadows, who was actually a professor of mine when I was an undergraduate, and her group, they were from the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Systems Dynamics group. And back then they had a computer program in which they were able to model 5 variables. And you can see the variables in this particular graph: natural resources, population, industrial output, pollution, and food per capita, sometimes called agriculture. And what they did was they adjusted the different quantities of these different variables and were able to come up with hundreds of different scenarios. And they ran them on the computer to see what would happen over time. Well, in fact, many of them ended up showing that civilization collapse would occur at different rates. And that's what we see in this particular graphic here. You can see how natural resources are being used up, and those natural resources is being converted into more people and converted into more population and industrial output until it reaches a certain point where pollution gets so much that and natural resources decreases so much that industrial output decreases, food decreases, and then the human population decreases in what we would normally call a collapse. So this idea and the notion of sustainability, which you can probably see a little more clearly in this particular graph, the red one is an increase, an overshoot, and then a collapse, runs out of resources, so hits a limitation of some kind. The blue one is you have the collapse also, but it goes down to a lower level, and then it fluctuates around the reduced K line you can see there, and that's actually sustainability, but with lower capacity. Ideally, the green is sustainability has occurred with a higher capacity. You see where it says low damage, resource recover, population fluctuates. And in the book, the lesson was kind of this society needs to reach sustainability or it will overshoot and collapse. And most of the scenarios seem to do that. This idea of sustainability became very popular and contributed very directly to the United Nations Conference on Sustainability and Development, which produced what many people call the Brundtland Report, because the conference was presided over by the Swedish Prime Minister, Gro Brundtland. And that really was the first time defined development, meeting the needs of the present and as well as meeting the needs of the future with the resources today. So that definition is still strong and ongoing. Limits to Growth also made an important distinction between growth and sustainability, that it is possible to have a sustainable society that is qualitatively always getting better, but it's not increasing in size, not increasing in consumption. And that's also what we might be looking for in sustainable tourism as well, which we'll talk about later, of course. But that's an important idea of increasing in quality without increasing in size and the consumption of resources. So once again, this key idea, it's not in Limits to Growth, but we're going to explore in this course is that development requires both the development of the exterior aspects, the physical aspects, the things that we can objectively mention, as well as interior qualities, both of us individually and collectively. You might remember that in the last lecture, the 4 quadrants that we used, where the left-hand column represented interior of the individual and collective, and the right-hand column represented the exterior of individual and collective. Now, an important milestone in the development literature came in 1973 with the publication of the book Small is Beautiful by E.M.F. Schumacher. And he had a definition of development as well that was pretty useful. And he said, development does not start with goods. It starts with people and their education, organization, and discipline. Without these 3, all resources remain latent, untapped, and potential. So he's clearly talking about 3 interior qualities that need to exist for the exterior qualities of resources to become tapped and to take advantage of that potential. The 2 need to work together. And in his book, he made an interesting observation about the supposed miracle recovery that took place in Europe after World War II, where many cities were smashed to bits, such as this photograph from Dresden, Germany, that was bombed into rubble by the Allies. Yet, despite being bombed into rubble, Germany and other countries in Europe very quickly recovered. And partially that is because of the external resources provided, for example, by the Marshall Plan of the United States, but certainly not completely. Schumacher notes that the people in Europe already had high level of education, organization, and discipline, which allowed them to take advantage and use efficiently and quickly the influx of resources that came after World War II. So once again, they needed both those interior qualities and the exterior resources. So a plan alone won't get you to development, and neither will having enough resources alone won't as well. So there are a lot of indicators of these exterior and interior development aspects. And certainly the most famous one for the exterior are the Sustainable Development Goals here. Like you can see these 17, and at least 16 out of the 17 are largely measuring exterior elements of society, civilization, the world. The 17th one, partnerships, you could argue, although even partnerships are collective exterior, but the relationships behind those partnerships are interior. So there are certainly interior important aspects as well as part of development. You may have heard of the book by Howard Gardner called Multiple Intelligences. And this is where he came up with the idea that there isn't just one intelligence. A person isn't just smart or stupid. There could be smart or stupid across 7 different areas in his framework. I always like to use the example of Michael Jackson, who was brilliant musically in the musical intelligence, but wasn't too advanced or developed in the interpersonal, maybe intrapersonal as well, but the interpersonal intelligence. But of course, you can continue to develop all of these 7 intelligences. Some people are born with greater potential and a higher ceiling than other people are. But using this idea of interior development, there's a nonprofit called the Inner Development Goals. And what they developed were inner development goals. They argue that the sustainable development goals aren't being met. Almost any of them aren't on schedule right now. They're failing. Why are they failing? They're failing because we do not have collectively or individually sufficiently developed interior development goals, which are kind of like basically skills and capacities. The point here isn't that you memorize these 5 areas, but just to give you an idea that there are corresponding inner development goals necessary for the exterior goals to be met. And here you see being, thinking, relating, collaborating, acting. You can stop the video if you want to read the stuff underneath, but that's not necessary for our purposes. So this interior and exterior aspects are intertwined, right? And they both evolve together. And this brings us back to tourism. Now, I want to share with you Brian's theory of recreation specialization, or I think it's a continuum of recreation specialization. This came out in 1977, and it's a very important part of the recreation literature. Now, Brian himself was an angler, so he developed this theory, this idea of this spectrum, based on his own personal experience, as well as looking at those people around him. So what he basically argued was that as the interest level of an angler, for example, increased from generalist or a novice, increasingly got more specialized, that had a lot of other ramifications. It also caused the self-identity of the angler to evolve from just a general recreationist to someone who takes pride in being an angler to someone who's a passionate angler. Their preferences about many different things also changed, also evolved along a sort of set pattern. And consequently, or simultaneously with this increase in interest, several exterior individual aspects as well changed. For example, the behaviors of the angler changed. Before, maybe they weren't too conservation minded. They'd go fishing, take the fish, bring it home. But as they become more specialized, they become more aware and conscious of the need to protect and conserve the resource, in this case, the fish. So they would do catch and release and then conservation. Also, the number of environmental group memberships would increase as they became more specialized. The equipment that they purchased would get more expensive and more sophisticated as they got more specialized. As you can imagine, maybe started out with just renting a fishing rod and then buying a cheap rod and then buying a more expensive rod and then buying sonar devices and all kinds of other tools of the trade. Well, at the same time, these individuals are maturing through different stages. So is the group of anglers, right? So then there's this group identity of anglers, which they form together in associations and a certain understanding of what it means to be an angler. Their relationships become deeper and more important, and their philosophy on conservation widens and emphasizes conservation much more than it did before. And thus the management systems that they participate in, again, you see this is the exterior collective, also changes as their interest increases and their behaviors change. So what Brian pointed out is take any kind of special recreation, doesn't have to be angling, can be hiking, can be boating, hunting. You find that there is this specialization spectrum where people go from generalist to more specialized, and many characteristics, both interior and exterior, collective and individual, are evolving. He didn't use those terms, but in the examples that he gives, you clearly see that they fit nicely into these 4 quadrants. Just to give you a little more specific example here, looking in the exterior individual, the angler might start out at the beginning just going fishing with the family. That's all they're interested in. But as they become more specialized, then they want to go hang out with other anglers and do things that maybe the wife or the husband, non-angler, isn't interested in doing. And then as they get even more specialized, then they only want to hang out with specialized anglers doing very specific things that no other angler or person would ever think of doing. Similarly, in the lower right quadrant, the conservation management system for these kind of people at the beginning, there's not even stocking. You just fish whatever's there because it's not really important what kind of fish you catch. And then over time, when you start to more specialize, you want to go after certain kinds of fish in certain kind of situations. So then you look for scenarios where they actually stock those kind of fish for you. And then even farther down, as you become more specialized, instead of stocking, you become more interested in conserving the actual target fish in its habitat so that it can always be sustainable and moved into the future. So this is the special, and we're going to get back and use this a little bit more in just a moment. But I also want to talk about some exterior development models, starting with a really general one for the entire macroeconomy. This classic example comes from Rostow, I think in the 1970s, I'm not sure, where he characterizes the economic state of the entire economy, starting with very traditional society with primitive technology, then moving into the industrial society, and then much more into advanced consumption society. So he has these different stages. People have argued with these stages, but the point is that on macroeconomics, there's also exterior development, things that can be measured, the systems with a lot of different quantitative indicators. But let's get back to tourism. That's what we're here for, right? So let's look at Butler's tourism area life cycle model. This is probably the most cited and important paper or theory to ever get published in the recreation literature, the tourism literature. This is 1980 when Butler came out. And he noticed that a lot of people, they would develop their tourism operations, or sites would develop tourism, and then eventually they would decline. And people really had no idea why that was happening. So he took kind of a systems perspective, and you can see there's an S-shaped curve here, and an S shape is very common system behavior. That's when something goes into exponential growth, but then something limits it. And you have that S shape. So basically, he talks about how in a site, you have an initial stage of discovery with just maybe a few specialists arrive, and they don't require much in the way of resources. Like, for example, backpackers here in Costa Rica at the very beginning in the 1970s, they didn't need big hotels. They didn't need transportation systems. Their requirements were minimal. But after the site begins to see potential in tourists, they start to build, right, facilities and services, and that allows the number of tourists to start increasing exponentially, which we have through the involvement and the development phase. And this is actually a rapid growth until it starts to slow down in the consolidation phase, because now you're running out of new visitors who can come in your particular market, and then eventually hits stagnation. Now, for Butler, stagnation was kind of a negative thing because it's hitting some kind of limits. But from the sustainability perspective, we could call stagnation sustainability. The difference is that most people didn't want stagnation because they wanted to keep growing, while in the sustainability context, the idea is to achieve sustainability, but it might look the same on the curve. So as the stagnation proceeds, there's three more pathways that are possible. One is to continue stagnated or plateaued or sustainable. Another is to decline, because eventually whatever those limits were continued to erode, for example, damaging the attraction with too much tourist impact or a changing market. Or the tourism destination or the operator figures out what the limits were and overcomes them. So that goes into what Butler called rejuvenation. Now, of course, eventually, even in the rejuvenation curve, it's going to hit more limits once again thereafter. And one of the important lessons from the Limits of Growth book is that even if you get beyond one limit, say with better technology, you'll quickly hit another limit and another limit, because nothing can grow forever. So now with this model, tourism developers can start to think consciously about what the conditions are that could limit their development and how they might move beyond that. So another important model that's built on top of Butler is the Doofus and Dearden wildlife tourism model. Now, if you look at this, you can still see this S-shaped curve that comes right out of Butler. That's kind of the backbone of their model here. And Doofus and Dearden also combine two other models along with Butler's, and that is Bryan's continuum of recreation specialization. You can see here it says expert, specialist, novice, generalist, and I'll talk about that in just a second, as well as limits of acceptable change. So in Doofus and Dearden, what they did is they described the wildlife user, understanding that recreationalists, as Bryan said, begin as generalists and evolve into experts. But from the site's point of view, a new site, experts arrive first. And then as the experts kind of lay the groundwork, the early adopters, the pioneers, as I mentioned in the previous case, the conditions start to become more apt to attract generalists or novices, and more novices come. So the ratio of novices to experts changes over time in the site. And just a couple characteristics. Again, the experts tend to be much more environmentally conscious, so their impact is much lower. The generalists don't have that high level of interest in the target species, whether that's bird watching or bison or whatever. So they want better conditions, and they don't want to live in a tent. I mean, sleep in a tent, so they want a hotel. They don't necessarily have 4x4 vehicles, so they want better roads. So they want all of these different services that make it more attractive for yet more novice generalists to come, and who create more impact and more pollution. And then the experts, like, I don't want to be here anymore. There's too many novices. I don't like the way they behave. They make too much noise. I'm going to go elsewhere. So as the number of visitors goes up, you can see the number of generalists goes up and the number of experts go down over time. Another important thing that Doofus and Dearden point out is that the relationship between the target species and people largely depends on cultural perceptions. So what's attractive, what's popular, depends on your own cultural ideals. For example, we oftentimes people want to travel and see dangerous animals more than innocuous. I mean, there's no inherent reason why a dangerous animal should be more interesting, but it is. They have a greater desire to see rarer animals, which is kind of ironic because it's often the human pressures that make them rare in the first place. So these are the cultural criteria that people use to decide what kind of animals they're going to go see. Now, the wildlife itself have certain criteria that Doofus and Dearden also point out. An ideal wildlife or a viewing animal for tourism is one that has a regular presence over a relatively small area. So therefore, looking for jaguars is bad because they need big areas and they're hard to see. But looking for maybe elephants, if you know where they are most of the time, and certain parks, they're good for wildlife watching because they are over a short area, you're more likely to find them. Another characteristic that's really important is the more we're able to understand, the more scientists are able to understand about the reproduction and the biology of a target species, the more that they can contribute to that animal's management and hopefully promote sustainability. If they don't know much about it, it's much harder to protect them. Doofus and Dearden also pointed out that change is inherent. Their industry is always changing. Visitor preferences and profiles are always changing. And when the visitors change, that changes the site. When the site changes, that changes the visitor. So there is this constant dance. And he points that out in this curve. As the number of visitors goes up, the sites have to change. And the kinds of visitors, like fewer experts and more novices over time. So another point that they integrate was the limits of acceptable change. And even though this is kind of a simplistic understanding of that model, they sort of use it anyway. And there's an A, B, and C that you can see in the model. And each one is like a major milestone in the evolution of wildlife tourism at a site. So A, or limit of acceptable change 1, is what they say is that's the maximum number of people without a noticeable impact on facilities or the environment. It doesn't say there's no impact. It's just noticeable or really acceptable on facilities and environment. And as this number of visitors continues to grow, you blow by that and you move closer to LAC2B, which that B represents when there's a noticeable decrease of the target species due to human impact. And maybe their presence or maybe their actual population. Either way, there's fewer of the target wildlife species. So that's limit of acceptable 2. And then finally, if we continue growing with the number of visitors, we could hit number 3, which is the maximum number of visitors to allow to sustain the activity, which isn't the same as carrying capacity. It just means if you keep having more visitors, then there'll be so much damage to the activity that it'll actually go into decline. So these are the 3. I wanted to tell you a story that I think fits this. It's from my own experience, this model of Doofus and Dearden. But it isn't wildlife. It's actually hotels in Cancun. Now, in Cancun in 1960s, this was a fishing village of maybe 100 people in a very poor region of Mexico. In the 1960s, the government targeted this region for tourism development because it had some very important Mayan sites nearby, Tulum, Chichen Itza, beautiful coral reefs, ocean, all kinds of natural attractions and cultural attractions as well. So by 1974, the first hotel opened its door, and soon thereafter, more and more hotels started appearing, especially along the hotel zone, which you can see the map is sort of that, well, I guess it's like a series of islands or one long skinny sandbar island that they build these hotels on away from the actual city. And as more and more hotels and more visitors meant more and more pollution, more and more trash, densification. So there were these impacts to the point where, and this is where I come into the story, I was hired by the Summit Foundation in Washington, D.C., which has a Mesoamerican coral reef conservation program, and they fund various organizations. So they sent me to Mexico, Honduras, and Belize to interview their grantees to see how they were doing in conserving the coral reef. And one of their grantees in Cancun was an environmental law nonprofit organization trying to control the growth and the pollution with using legal mechanisms. So I was interviewing Patricio Marin in 2008, who's an environmental law, and he noted how Spanish hotel chains, and there were Spanish hotel are in Cancun, destroyed Mallorca's economy. Mallorca is a port city on the south of Spain. And in fact, he pointed out Riu, Riu hotels don't even intend to own their hotels more than 10 years in Cancun, because as the city becomes over densified, prices will drop. And what they'll end up doing is just selling their hotels off to make luxury condominiums. In 10 years, the owner of Bahia hotels said they won't even have any hotels. They will be just luxury condos 10 years later. And then the big, huge section south of Cancun, which has more beaches and more Mayan sites and more natural reserve called the Riviera Maya, that too in 10 or 15 years will go through the same process. So I wrote in my evaluation, my photojournalistic evaluation, quote, Patricio explains that studies show that not only do international chains pay few taxes, but each new hotel room brings 20 new people, workers, and families. If one considers that the city must provide them with services such as water, housing, streets, etc., and when one compares this with how much money enters, then the hotel business is bad business. He noted that Paris has a sustainable hotel business because it limited the number of hotels. If you want to create a new hotel, you have to buy an old one and renovate or destroy it and build a new one. So assuming the trends of Butler's area life cycle model exist, this would seem like in 2008 that they may be in consolidation, perhaps. And they were getting worried about the limits, which could be or pollution and densification and prices going down. Yet, here we are in 2024, and we see that right after the pandemic, hotels started filling up rapidly, air traffic increased, the number of airline seats increased. Why is that? Well, maybe that Cancun had reached stagnation, but they used a strategy of not closing during the pandemic. That gave them a comparative advantage. Also, Riviera Maya opened up and new sites opened up, once again helping Cancun get out of stagnation, avoid decline, and actually go into juvenation where they are today. So whether or not, I don't have the data to back that up, but the behavior that we see in Cancun seems to fit into Butler's model. Well, since now we're talking about tourism, let's talk about tourism specifically, and not so much development till we get to sustainable development in a later lecture. So despite that travel and tourism's main product is intangible, that is the experience, it's still one of the world's largest industries. According to IBISWorld, which I understand is something that rates industries, says that in 2024, tourism and travel will be the third fastest growing industry and will be the 10th largest in the world based on revenues. In fact, before the pandemic, there was 334 million jobs in tourism, over $9 trillion in economic activity, and 1 in 4 of all new jobs created across the world were related to tourism. 10% of all jobs and 10% of the global GDP. You don't have to memorize those numbers, but they're big numbers. And that's the point here, is there are a lot of tourists, and tourists are only a percentage of visitors, which is even a larger category, right? A tourist is basically an overnight visitor, someone who spends overnights in a location that's outside their normal context and purchases touristic services. So you can read about the definition, specific definition of visitor and tourist in the IUCN book that we're reading. So the only classification in this lecture of tourism, even though there's a lot of literature on classifying tourism, I think one really rises up in importance. And this one's actually one I came up with because it talks about the difference between how we conduct tourism versus what is the theme of the tourism. So what I call the modality, versus the theme or the niche, or the how do we conduct tourism versus the what are we visiting or why we're visiting. And I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the tours. In terms of the how, we have mass tourism, responsible tourism, ecotourism, and there's overlap, thematically as well. You can argue the ecotourism has some thematic component. Community-based tourism is both how and to some degree what. accessible tourism, and of course, sustainable tourism, and all-inclusive, which is both a how and a what as well. So let's look at some of the many themes or niches that there are in the tourism world. There's bird watching and agro-tourism and dark tourism and scientific tourism and educational tourism and medical and nature-based. And I will say nature-based is a much broader term than ecotourism, because nature-based is just using any natural attraction, whether it's conscious, sustainable, responsible, or not. While ecotourism does imply good things coming out of it. Supernatural tourism, culinary, sexual tourism, and I don't mean all of these are completely legal, although sexual tourism is legal in a lot of places under certain conditions. Sun and surf, you could argue sun and surf is a nature-based attraction, beaches in the ocean, but not necessarily sustainable in any way. All-inclusive, rural, wellness, gastronomic, business, conference, astronomical, diving, which could be out of an airplane, or I suppose a scuba. Space tourism is a new niche coming on. Cultural tourism, pilgrimages, maybe one of the oldest kinds of tourism. Wildlife, theme parks, sports, and of course, etc. So there is a lot of different kinds, and you certainly will run into these different topics as we go, some of these different topics as we go through the course. A few of these you probably won't touch at all. Another important aspect of understanding the tourism industry is who are the actors? For this, I'm going to use a graphic from one of the readings that you have, reading 8 from the Public Use Planning Manual. Here it talks about some of the actors, although not all of them. So first you start off from the top with the wholesaler. And this is a company who's able to find many different packages and get them for a low price and resell them to travel agents and tour operators who can then sell them to the public at retail prices. So they don't sell directly to tourists. They sell directly to other businesses, like a wholesaler and anything. You generally don't find wholesale prices in stores. The stores get the wholesale prices, but not the customers in the stores. Then you have the travel agents, which are somewhat of a dying species, but these are people who help customers, tourists, find, purchase packages, organize their trips, and they do a lot of the desk work, the organizing, but they don't actually lead them. That would be the operators. Now, an outbound operator is a tour operator who brings you from your place to someplace else outside, oftentimes internationally. So say you want to go to Botswana, the Okavango Delta, you could hire an American tour operator to bring you to Africa. And there you go, you're the tourist. You get to Africa, and it may be that you're received by a local Botswanan tour company. So that would be the inbound operator. It's receiving the tourists coming inward. And they may work, they're subcontracted by the American company, or they might work together. So they're in the country. There's nonprofits that get involved trying to promote community development and conservation, like the nonprofit I run. The government, of course, also is very much interested. Government promotes tourism, invests in tourism, collects data on tourism, does a lot of different aspects. And then, of course, once you get to Botswana, there's oftentimes many service providers providing transportation, food, housing, handicrafts, renting equipment. There's many different local service providers. So in fact, that's a pretty good number, but that's definitely not all of the actors. Can you just take a moment and think, maybe if you turn off the video and think of a different kind of actor I don't have here, and then turn it back on and we'll discuss. All right, welcome back. Well, since I can't ask you which ones you came up with, I'll mention a few others. Another is a Destination Management Organization, a DMO. That's an organization that tries to bring the different actors, stakeholders together at a particular destination and control and promote the development of tourism, hopefully in a way that benefits that destination. So it may be a nonprofit organization that works with tour operators, or may even have tour operators, government, as different members of the actual DMO. Otherwise, there's no other sort of neutral or cross-sectorial organization who's trying to promote tourism in a certain way, rather than just letting it go crazy on its own. Other tourism promotion bodies would include chambers of tourism, like a Chamber of Commerce, national tourism institutes, like here in Costa Rica, we have the Costa Rican Institute for Tourism, which is a government agency in charge of promoting. As I mentioned earlier, the government has a very active involvement. There's tourism boards. There's universities that study, influence, and promote tourism. Here we're in a sustainable tourism class by a university. Protected area managers, you could call them local service providers because they are providing the conservation service, or you could give them a category unto themselves. And an important lesson from seeing all of these actors is tourism is a highly interlinked industry between lots of different actors depending on each other's across public and private partnerships. Tour operators oftentimes using many different service providers. I run educational study abroad courses here, and I have to pay different sites. I have to hire tourism, bus company, I have to hire restaurants, have to hire guides. So even in a small package or product, there's oftentimes quite a variety of different service providers in this tightly knit industry with lots of personal and trust relationships between these buyers and sellers. And of course, tourism ripples out and affects many other aspects, services and roads and electricity. We'll talk about different kinds of impacts, positive and negative, a little later. One other issue I wanted to point out about the tourism industry, and this is a point that the business sector has clear, but the nonprofit and university sectors oftentimes forget, is that demand or attractiveness is decided by the market, is decided by tourists, not decided by the providers. And oftentimes universities and nonprofits are trying to promote non-business objectives, conservation, community development, education, and they forget that you can't just do an inventory of all of the attractions. I mean, you can, but you can forget that there's some scientific process to identifying attractions, but ultimately it's the market who decides if people aren't interested, they're not going to go. So this confusion can lead to tourism projects that oftentimes fail because, for example, you want to help this particular community. So you figure out, oh, well, this tree or this burial ground must be an attraction because the community needs something to be attractive and participate in tourism. But then the market disagrees and the project fails. So it's important to have products that's successful, but what are the main components of a tourism product? Well, here's one model that I learned from the Honduran Institute of Tourism with a small modification years ago. So the first component is access. You need access to the destination. If there's no access, you have nothing. And then at the destination, you need to have an attraction, right? That the market regards as an attraction. Then you need an activity to interact with that attraction, to get to know that attraction. It can be as simple and passive as sitting in a chair watching a sunset, or it can be as active as jumping out of an airplane during a war zone. Whatever it is, that activity allows you to interact with the attraction. To offer that activity, there needs to be a series of services like the ones I mentioned before: transportation, food, housing, guiding. And then the combination of these services and the activity and the attraction is put together into an opportunity to have an experience, which we'll talk about in a little moment, and what an opportunity is. Then you need trained personnel to offer these services, because if they're not, you'll have low quality or failing services. And then, of course, you need to promote. Otherwise, the market will never know about this product, no matter how good it is. So I'll just give you one example. In 2006, my wife and I went to an international interpretation conference in Sweden, and we had the opportunity to go on a guided hike, or walk, really, at Uppsala University, which I think is the oldest university in Europe, in the Linnaeus Garden. And Linnaeus is a very famous biologist in the history of biology for reasons that aren't important in this moment. So we had access because, this first point, the conference provided us buses. There's definitely an attraction. It's a very nice garden, very historic garden at a historic university. The activity was a guided walk with a historical interpreter, who you can see pictured right there. The services were, well, transportation, entrance, security, maintenance, because ultimately by paying entrance, you're paying for the maintenance of the garden and the knowledge that it's contained therein. And obviously the historical interpreter himself. So that whole space in the park, in that moment, with this guide constituted the opportunity to have an experience. And of course, there's trained personnel. The historical interpreter was very good. And I imagine, although I didn't see, that somehow the university promoted this so that the conference could find it. So, since we're speaking of products, here's 4 products right here. Now, oftentimes you'd call these the products, but in fact, each one of these is not the final product, right? We are looking for the product of the product. Why do we have drills, for example? We have drills to make holes. So holes would be the product of the product. For the automobile or the car, the final product could be the sensation of autonomy and mobility, right? Not the car itself, unless of course you're a car collector. And then the Frisbee disc at the bottom, well, because I play Ultimate, I had to include that. Could be exercise, recreation, or even fame, if that's what you're after. The perfume, self-esteem. And then, of course, in our own industry, we have a tourism package. Now, the product is you pay $49,999, whatever that unit is, and you have the product. But that, again, is not the product of the product, which would be the experience. And oftentimes experience is misunderstood by many in the tourism field, which is kind of ironic, since if experience is really the product of our industry, we should really know what experiences are about, but that's not always the case. Sometimes experiences are confused with the activity. Like someone will say, hiking, that hiking was a great experience. Or they'll think experience is the emotion that you feel, like the visitor had, we try to measure their experience with a satisfaction survey. So we think it's just their feeling or emotion that they have. Or they'll confuse it with the place, like, oh, the Paris experience. So all of these are reductionist because they're just pieces of a more holistic, overarching understanding of what an experience is. So let's just take a quick look at what that would be. But first I ask you, my dear students, where does an experience take place? And don't say Bali. I don't mean the physical location. I mean, literally, it takes place in our minds. You can't find anyone's experience anywhere outside their own mind. So if that's the case, then a tourism provider or an operator really can't sell you an experience, give you an experience, or provide you an experience. All they can do is provide you an opportunity to have an experience. And what they do is they mold or condition that opportunity through manipulating a whole series of different factors or levers, you might say, to increase the probability that you will have a positive experience as a result of that opportunity. So if they're moving lots of different levers, then really what we're saying is that this is a multi-dimensional space, that which is the experience opportunity. Now, I'm going to use a metaphor to explain this. And here's an activity for you as well. So imagine a circus tent. That tent represents the experience opportunity. Within the circus tent, there are many different variables and dimensions that different kinds of actors and designers are manipulating so that synergistically they work together to give you the greatest possibility of having a positive experience. Now, of course, they can't guarantee that, because at any given moment, you could just be walking and trip over your own shoelaces and bang your head and basically ruin the day at the circus. Not everything is in their control. So what I'm going to do is now show you sort of a graphic. And I want you, with a pen and a paper, to write down, as you see elements appearing in this graphic, identify what dimension of the experience that those represent. And then, of course, you're also going to see different designers and what element of the experience do they represent. Now, I'm not going to talk during this, so you stop the video right now, get your writing utensil, and then start back up again. All right, welcome back. So here we go. We're going to the circus. Write down the different dimensions that you see as they appear. All right, here we go. All right, had to turn the music off so we can discuss it. So here we are. You see quite a variety of different elements. See the music, the lighting, the smells of the food. You can see how the flow of visitors is controlled through the ticket office. It's called the boletos. I guess if you don't speak Spanish, you wouldn't have known that. And how people are moved to the seating. You can imagine that the temperature is controlled. There's a number of different actors in the big ring who are influencing using humor and excitement and movement. The trapeze artists, you see the lighting on the poles. And of course, behind all these physical elements, you have different kinds of designers, choreographer for the dancing and the moving, the set designer, the artists, the writer for what's being said, the wardrobe, the engineer who builds this, the cook who makes the food, the light and sound specialist, the architect, the music director, and all of this is being coordinated by the director. So this here is an experience opportunity, and it's within this space, many of the different conditions are being managed. You could take this space and put it in a museum or put it in a national park. It wouldn't literally look like a circus, but you could see where there's a whole multi-dimensional variety of elements going on that are contributing to the overall potential or opportunity to have an experience. So, well, what then is an experience itself then? Well, here's a model. It comes from the book called The Experience Economy, with a modification of my own, to try and give a more holistic understanding of what experience is. So every experience starts off, there's an actor, would be the tourist, they're doing something in a context, interacting with heritage, and this is an event. So you can see in this photograph, there's an event going on, and this event provokes emotions. Could be good or could be bad. Matter of fact, the guy on the left, on the right, in the front, looks like he's having a different emotion as the woman on the left, right next to him. Very different emotions. But the intensity of the emotion is a signal to the mind that something important is going on and needs to be understood, whether for your survival, if it's a negative emotion, or for your enjoyment or for your own growth. So these emotions generate the creation of meanings. And this is the part that I added because of the importance of heritage interpretation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the more intense the emotion, the greater the meanings are produced in your mind. And if they're really important, the greater and deeper memories will be produced. And in the future, as you go through other new events, those memories will affect your emotion, and those will affect the meanings will affect your emotions as well. So it's a feedback system. All of this together is the experience. Now, interestingly enough, there's 4 main components of an experience. I should say, before I get to that point, I want to say this idea of creating meanings is very important to the emotion, because when you create a new idea, a new relationship about a place, about heritage, an animal, or your relationship with that place, or your relationship with nature, or how the universe works. Creating that new idea is like splitting an atom. It releases so much emotional energy, and it's such an important contributing factor to the overall experience. Like you can imagine when Einstein finally discovered E equals mc squared, he didn't just sit back and say, yeah, I did it. We'll have lunch. No, he probably had an explosion of energy that he finally solved this or discovered this. And a great amount of emotional energy equals mc squared, you might say. And this energy is what allows visitors to benefit from tourism. It's what moves people to positive actions for a place, like donations or contributions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an important part that oftentimes gets left out of the four main components. Tourism is very good at identifying three or dealing with three components of the experience. First one is the place or the heritage. You know, most tourist operators have a good sense of that. The activity to interact with it. Tourism has a really good notion of activities. The quality of the service, which also, you know, good tour operators know that. We know the difference between good and bad tour operators based on their quality of service. But the last one, the one that focuses on helping visitors create powerful meanings that unleash emotional energy, that's interpretation, the field of interpretation. In the field of interpretation, and we're not going to spend much time in this course about this, but it is an area of specialty of my own, is basically that branch of communication that helps people concentrate on and create new meanings through experiences. So yes, that's an actual objective, and it helps to deepen their appreciation, their relationship with whatever is being interpreted, whether it be a place, an object, an idea, or even themselves. The universe, nature, the human condition, all of those things can be interpreted through a tourism product. So having said that, I just wanted to show you two videos to finish up. One's a bad experience, and I want you to look at the different conditions that create this bad experience.
You deserve the better things in life. You deserve the tranquility and complete escape of a princess cruise.
So this is a nice transition from a bad experience to a good experience. And even in that short period in the cruise ship, you can see a whole series of different conditions that are being manipulated to change this from a bad to a good experience. All right, now I'm going to show you another video of a woman who is having an experience. And I want you to think about the different conditions and how the tour operator is manipulating or potentially manipulating. You might actually have to use your imagination to fill some in to make this person's experience a positive one. Whoops, let me just go. I didn't mean to do that one. Here we go.
nobody hating on us. Cause the sky's so fabulous. I'ma be real on us. Nobody got nothing on us. Girls be all on us from London back down to the US. As we rockin', that's contagious. Monkey business outrageous. Just confess your girl admits that we the shit. FRESH, we fresh. GEF, that's right, we definite. BEP, we reppin' it. So turn me up, turn me up, turn me up. Come on, baby, just pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it. And side, side, yo, yo. Turn up the radio, blast your stereo right now. This joint is fizzling, it's sizzling right. You check this out right here. Do wanna hate on us, do need to ease on up, do wanna act on gut, but do get shut like Flavor Chuck. Chick say she ain't down, but chick backstage when we in town. She like men on drums, she wanna hit and run. Yeah, that's the speed, that's what we do, that's who we be. BLACKEYEDD to the E, then the A to the S. When we play, you shake your ass. Shake it, shake it, shake it, girl. Make sure you don't break it, girl. We gon' turn it up, turn it up, turn it up. Come on, baby, just pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it, and side, side, yo, yo. Turn up the radio, blast your stereo right now. This joint is fizzling, it's sizzling right.
From the Philippines, live and direct, rocking the scene. Breaking on down for the B-boys and B-girls, we're in to do they thing. Pump it, louder, come on, don't stop, and keep it going, do it. Let's get it on, move it.
Come on, baby, do it. Blow my mind, baby.
Muy bien. Very good.
Okay, I would like every person to write 5 conditions that they see that have been potentially manipulated by the tour operator and put it in the WhatsApp chat. And we'll all see together how many conditions we can come up with. Other than that, thank you very much and see you in Moodle.